What has been on the news lately, if you're watching any normal news outlets, has been the trial of the ex-president of the United States, right? Donald Trump. You can't get away from that. That's that's one of three biggies. You know, the trials for holding confidential documents, the trial about the insurrection, I don't say resurrection, the insurrection. Now this is a trial. They call it the hush money trial, but really it's it's preventing. It's a trial about trying to prevent news coming out that would affect the election. And if you're watching the news carefully, you know that all the testimonies have been wrapped up. The defense was pretty quick. There's only 2 witnesses. But the prosecution had some pretty important biggie witnesses. They had the woman that Donald Trump apparently had the affair with, or had spent time with. And they also had his former lawyer, who was like a fixer, right? And he apparently was supposed to be the guy that was going to reveal all the connections and all this other stuff. And so everybody was very, very interested in hearing this guy come up, Michael Cohen. I want to tell you about another trial that had kind of a similar situation, but different circumstances. And they were looking for a star witness as well. This is a trial that occurred in Los Angeles about 60 years ago. And some of the details here may not be true, but this is a story as I heard it. It was a difficult case, and there was a lot of circumstantial evidence. And the man's defense lawyer, he was an older gentleman, a little cocky, very confident. He knew that his case was not that strong, so he thought, this is the defense lawyer, he thought that he would try a bit of a last-minute desperate attempt, but he thought it was a very ingenious way of summing up his defense. He said this: "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you must find my client not guilty of murder. If there is the slightest doubt in your minds that he is not the murderer, he must be found not guilty. And now I have one final witness," he said. "The true murderer is about to walk through that door." The true murderer. And all the eyes swung in the courtroom, almost swung towards that door. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited. But nobody came in. The lawyer triumphantly turned to the jury and said, "You see, ladies and gentlemen, there is doubt in your minds. Otherwise, you would not be staring at that door. So you must find my client not guilty." You see the logic in that? Kind of clever, wasn't it? The lawyer and everybody else did, however, came back 5 hours later, and the foreman stood up and said, "We find the defendant guilty. We find the defendant guilty." And the defense lawyer was so upset, he was almost beside himself, that they could pass judgment on his client, even after he had done that cute little trick to prove that they had some doubt in their minds. He yelled out, impetuously, he yelled out, "How can you find him not guilty? You all were staring at that door. You had doubt in your minds." And then the jury foreman turned to him and said, "Yes, most everybody was looking at the door, except for me. I was watching your client, and his eyes did not turn towards that door because he knew that he was guilty." Okay. I thought that was kind of a cute story. Probably not true. But you know, in contrast to the Los Angeles, that courtroom many years ago, there was a star witness that did appear in the life of Jesus. And he answered basically the most important question that we're going to have to answer ourselves in our lifetime. What we're dealing today is the most important question that you will have to deal with in your lifetime. and that I have to deal with in my lifetime. Who was that star witness? The star witness was God himself, the Heavenly Father. And he's telling us who his Son is, who Jesus is, and what we are to do. I want us to parse through this passage and go through every section. But as I go along, I am mindful of the fact that for some of you, you've read this story so many times. You've heard it as a child in Sunday school. You've seen it or heard it being preached from pulpits possibly dozens of times, or read it yourself many times. And it's not that new to you, is it? Right? Oh, well, this is a transfiguration. It's in the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. For some reason, it's not in John. We have to think that through someday to figure out what that is. We don't know for sure, but possibly because John's approach to the life of Christ is a little more thematic. You realize that this is an important scene in Christ's life. Actually, the older church, the early church, and the church fathers saw this as much more important than we tend to do so today. Today, we tend to look at this passage and say, oh, it's just a Sunday school story. Nice little story about Jesus becoming shiny. Well, it's much more than that. Actually, in the traditions of the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox in that direction, they saw this as almost as important, if not as important, as the crucifixion. This is considered by the early church and by modern scholars as one of 5 of the most important events, pivotal events in the life of Christ. What are they? The baptism of Christ, the transfiguration of Christ, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the ascension. And so for some reason, our church has, over the years, the churches have lost its importance. And with that, we've lost the awe. We've lost the wonder. You know, I remember as a child being in wonder of certain things that I've seen. The stars at night. Recently, some of you saw the eclipse. I think that Catherine and Joseph got the right idea. They planned for it. They made a big deal of it. I was so busy, I just kind of said, oh, it's just a little dark period. This passes by. But I want you today, as we go through this passage, to get the awe. To get how important this passage is. I want you to have that feeling that Alan Grant had in Jurassic Park when he first saw those dinosaurs. Even though he knew they were coming up, something was coming up. Remember that scene in Jurassic Park? He's in that Jeep with Ellie and that old guy that is the founder of that place. And they stop there and they see those huge dinosaurs, and he's been studying them his whole life. And suddenly he's face to face with these dinosaurs, and he falls down, and he takes his hat off. He starts to hyperventilate. He falls on his knees. I remember feeling this way when I was on short-term mission many years ago in Irian Jaya, on the top of the world, it seemed, in the high mountaintops, and seeing a village in which the gospel had come and changed over 90% of the people, and then seeing them play out there, and then seeing the clouds underneath us because we're above the clouds. I don't know about yourself. You know, the first time you met your future spouse, maybe the first time that you went camping or you were outside and you saw how beautiful this world is, or you traveled to certain parts of this world and you thought to yourself, how can it be that God had created such a wonderful place? And you were in awe and you lost your words. And sometimes you were frightened and you realize how great God is. I want you to feel that way today. That's what Mark wants you to feel. That's what the gospel writers want you to feel. I know that we are not covering much in the book of Mark because we have such a short time, and we're trying to get through all books of the Bible in 5 years. We will cover other events in the life of Christ when we get to Matthew, Luke, and John. But today, I realized in coming up with today's message and dividing up the sections, I realized that all of our passages are focused in on this section in Mark, chapter 6 to 9. Mark is the rushed gospel, it seems. But like all the other gospels, Mark, his theme is to show us who Jesus Christ is. His purpose, his goal is to help us to see that this man is the Messiah, the Son of God, the God-man, He stands head above all other men, not just in terms of his goodness being a little bit better than others, but there's just no comparison whatsoever. No comparison whatsoever. In this passage, the three disciples, the closest to Jesus, are brought into a position where they must realize they are overwhelmed. They're terrified. And because they suddenly realize who it is that Jesus is to some extent, they still don't fully realize. You'll see that later on. That's what makes the later episodes in the life of Christ, when the disciples abandon him, when they still question him. That's what makes it so incredible when you think about it. They have seen the transfiguration, and yet for some reason they still don't believe who Jesus is. Only now, in retrospect, when Peter is talking to Mark, and Peter is recounting the stories, does it come out. But back then, it didn't get through their thick skulls that they're dealing with someone way beyond. This is a guy who communicates with God and with Elijah and with Moses. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's like a wow moment. I remember many years ago, I just happened to see one of these movies. I forget which one it was. One of those Fast and Furious movies, You know, Fast and Furious, the movies. Vin Diesel, cars, crash-ups, and all those sorts of things. And I was watching it with a bunch of guys, and it's a guy movie. And I remember one scene in which, I don't know if you remember it, Vin Diesel is trying to save his girlfriend who doesn't know that she's his girlfriend, and she falls out of a car, they're moving really fast, and he jumps out of his car, and he dives across the screen, and he grabs her in midair, and then dives and then tumbles with her onto the front of another car, right, and saves her life and his. And there was all this action going on, it was so loud, and the whole theater suddenly went dead silent. Dead silence. Because they realized what an amazing scene. Well, here, Mark, Matthew, and Luke are telling us, you be dead silent because look at what you're seeing. This guy communicates with God and with Moses and with Elijah. Yesterday, we had a pretty amazing seminar series. Thank you very much, our small group ministry. We had Stephen Hawkins come share with us. And there was a lot of highlights. And I'm going to try to summarize some notes for some of you if you want the notes. And it was long. It was from 10 to 4. And Stephen's talked without notes this entire time. He just went through some of the questions we had, and he gave us some handouts. He did an amazing job. You know Stephen Hawkins. He's preached here before. And he's a good friend of mine. And he still amazes me. You know, I asked him a question yesterday. Remember the question I asked him about, I said, how do you minister to different levels of society? I know that you come out, sometimes you contact the royal family in England. Sometimes you send them letters. Do they ever send you letters back? And he goes, oh yeah, I interact with them a lot. He goes on a regular basis almost. He interacts with the royal family. And he shows this on his phone, right? He goes to his phone, he finds like two, like a couple of days ago or yesterday or today, whatever, pretty recently, a message. And he reads, please pray for me. I'm afraid that Charles and William are possibly going to take away my royal status, right? Whatever you call it. And the same with Meghan's royal status. And it turns out as Prince Harry texting Stephen Hawkins about prayer, asking for prayer. And he talks about his interaction with the Queen. He talks about his interaction with Prince Charles. And he mentioned a few things about that. And I am pretty sure in that audience, that in the chapel, some people were saying, whoa. This guy interacts with the Queen and the King of England now, and with the Queen, and he gets invited to all their dinners, some of their dinners, and the coronation and all that sort of stuff. Who is this guy? Right? Who is this guy? That's what the disciples should have realized. That's what they were feeling. Who is this guy? Who is this guy who is texting the God of heaven in today's language? Who is this guy? And what does that mean for us today? That's the important part. Let me quickly go through this passage with you. In verse 2, we're told that after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. The context is that in Mark chapter 8, verse 27, we read that people have been asking the question, who is Jesus? And it's clear from the response that it was a hot topic. The disciples were told in verse 28, replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah. Interesting, right? And still others, one of the other prophets. But it wasn't just the crowds who were talking about Jesus. His own disciples were asking the same question. We read in Mark chapter 8, verse 29, then he asked them, but what about you? Peter answered, you are the Christ. And in Matthew's gospel, in chapter 16, verse 16, the parallel passage, it says that Peter said, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. That question was burning on the lips of everybody. Who is this guy? Right? And in the previous chapter, here in Mark, we see that there's human responses, but here now in chapter 9, we see divine responses. And the transfiguration took place because God the Father wanted to answer that question definitively, once and for all. Who is Jesus? Now, Jesus led them to a high mountain. There are lots of different possibilities of what the mountain was. We're not told in scriptures, so I'm not going to say definitively what it was. A lot of people say it was Mount Hermon. I'm not sure. But who does Jesus take? He takes his inner group. He loved the disciples, but he chose different groups of disciples. If you look very carefully in the Gospels, you can document that there were actually three groups, kind of. There was an inner group, kind of medium inner group, a group that's more that's in the Gospels a little bit more, and then there's the outer group of disciples that have very little interaction that we read about. G.C. Morgan wrote concerning these special three, Peter, James, and John. There can be no doubt that these men, Peter, James, and John, were the most remarkable in the apostolate. Peter loved him. John loved him. John he loved. James was the first to seal his testimony with his blood. He became like the head of the early church, right? Even their blunders proved their strength. They were the men of enterprise, men who wanted thrones and places of power. So they were ambitious a little bit. They had mistaken ideas, all of them, and yet a proven capacity for holding the keys and occupying the throne. Right? These were the three that were in the inner circle. We know that because on special occasions, Jesus took only these three. In the raising of Jairus' daughter in Luke 8:51, they were granted a preview of Jesus' mastery over death. Here on the Mount of Transfiguration, they gained clear insight into the importance of Jesus and his impending death. On the Mount of Olives in Mark 13:3, they marveled at his prophetic discernment. In the Garden of Gethsemane in Matthew chapter 26, verse 37, they glimpsed the sufferings of the Savior that would be the cost of their salvation. These were the three, and they were given a special audience. And they saw Jesus change. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. While Peter and James and John arrived on the mountaintop with Jesus, he changed right in front of them. And the word we use often is transfiguration or transfigured. The Greek word, Latin first of all, is a change in appearance. But the Greek word is actually, the Koine Greek word is actually a lot more stronger. It's metamorphosis. It's, what happens when you get that butterfly out of the caterpillar or whatever, right? It's a real big change. And his glory as a Son of God was being revealed to them. And obviously, it reflects the Shekinah glory of God. We talked about that earlier. His presence became dazzling white, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, John 1:1, and then 4 and 5. Jesus could change himself because he is the light. So the response to the Father's part of the response to the Father's question, who is Jesus, was to reveal Jesus in his full glory. In the parallel passage in Matthew's gospel, the record is more detailed. It records that Jesus' face shone like the sun, and his clothes became a dazzling white. Remember in the Old Testament? Same thing happened to Moses to some extent. He goes up to the mountain, he meets with God, he comes back down, and he's shining. So he had to cover himself. We read in Exodus 34, verses 29 to 33. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of testimony, holding the 10 commandments in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. And then we're told in the following verses that everybody saw his face that was shining. Right? In the same way, the glory of God that was reflected in Moses was revealed in Christ. God was giving them, the disciples, clear evidence of who Jesus was. And look at who Jesus was with. In verses 4 to 6, we're told, and there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Peter. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And the writer, who is Mark, reflecting what Peter said, because Peter told him this story, said he did not know what to say. They were so frightened. So Peter, in reflecting this story to Mark, is saying, you know what, I was flabbergasted. I don't know what to say. I said something kind of stupid. A lot of us do that. I do that all the time. I don't know about you. I was going to think of a funny example, but there's too many of them in my lifetime, where I'm caught off guard, I just say the wrong thing, right? And Peter kind of said the wrong thing. Jesus was with Moses and Elijah, and by the way, that tells us a few things. First of all, they recognized Moses and Elijah. They weren't sure. There was no announcement made there. Somehow they recognized Moses and Elijah. In heaven, we'll recognize each other, even if we won't need business cards to show who we are. Okay, there'll be this amazing recognition. And on top of that, there's a doctrine that some people believe in called soul sleep, and in that, after you die, you don't go straight to heaven. Your soul just kind of falls into oblivion, and you're in a non-state, and you don't recognize, you don't have a thinking state, and you just wake up at the resurrection. Well, this kind of is an indicator against that, because here we have Moses and Elijah talking to Jesus, right, before the final resurrection, right? And here we have them representing 2 things. Now, there's one modern scholar that would point out that Moses and Elijah, traditionally, Moses represents the law and Elijah represents the prophets. And I tend to go with the traditional, right? And you look at the old pictures, the old iconography, Moses often carrying the 10 Commandments, And then we have one modern scholar that pointed out that the context of it is about the resurrection. And it's Moses and Elijah who are the ones who talked about the future resurrection. So that's another possible interpretation of why they're there. And Peter, in his impetuous nature, says, let's build 3 tents to honor you guys, these 3, because they didn't have a lot there. What can they do? There's 3 of them. But I think right after he says that very soon after, the other 2 disappeared. Right? And Jesus remains alone by himself in verse 30, in Matthew 17:36. That's what we're told. As one Bible commentator put it, the law and the prophets have served their turn, and passed away. He who is a fulfillment of both alone remains. Who is Jesus? Another aspect that God the Father's answer to this transfiguration tells us is that Jesus is the one who's going to replace the Old Covenant. A new era is on the horizon. The Old Covenant, represented by Moses and Elijah, are going to pass away. The new covenant is going to come through the death and resurrection of Jesus and a relationship with Jesus, right? Let's look at the clouds and the commands, verses 7 to 10. Then a cloud appeared and enveloped them. And a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son whom I love, listen to him." Suddenly when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. We've seen the change. We've seen the company. We talked about the context. What happens now? Now, this awe-inspiring event, Peter makes a little bit of a silly suggestion. Comes the cloud, and first of all, the Jews knew there were several representations of God in the Old Testament, but one of them clearly was the cloud. Clouds are symbolic of his presence. In the Exodus, time and time again, God's divine presence came in the cloud on the holy mountain at the tent of meeting, and now here on the Mount of Transfiguration. And what does God the Father say from the clouds? He gives them at least two commands. The first is that he says, "This is my Son whom I love. Listen to him." And with these words from the cloud, the Father affirms Jesus' role as Messiah, as the Savior, and as the Son of God. And then there's another command. Sorry, this command comes from God. There's another command that comes from Jesus. Jesus says, as they return to the foot on the foot of the mountain, keep what they've seen to themselves. That's the second command. You see, Jesus had to climb another mountain, not the Mount of Transfiguration. He had to climb a mountain with a cross on his back. If people know what the disciples have seen, they may not let him finish the work of redemption. So Jesus commands them to wait until after the resurrection before they speak of what they saw. That's the last time, actually, in Mark, we told that. Remember that we mentioned right at the beginning of this series about this messianic secret, the reticence to show who Jesus was? Well, now it's becoming open. With the witness of the cross and the resurrection, the realities of the transfiguration come into clearer focus. God, in the form of the Son, sacrifices himself for the sinner. We're told in Luke that what Jesus was discussing with Elijah and with Moses was his coming departure, his death, his burial, his resurrection. They could be talking about anything else. They could be talking about the future of Israel, World War II and World War III, the Holocaust. They could be talking about modern technology and what's going to happen. They could have been talking about, the discovery of insulin or AI and how it's going to affect the universe. No. They talked about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, his coming departure. And then, on the way down, after Jesus had mentioned that to the disciples are discussing it, the resurrection. Like most of the Jewish people of the day, except for the Sadducees, right? There are notable exceptions. The disciples believed in a future resurrection. What confused them was here Jesus is making an implication that his own resurrection was imminent, and thus so was his death. The disciples' confusion provides further evidence that they still do not understand the messianic mission. And now we get to the crux of the whole thing, the heart of the matter. In verses 11 to 13, and they asked him, "Why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" And Jesus gives a really interesting answer. He says, "To be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as is written about him." You see, the disciples still didn't get it. They were wondering, well, what about, is Jesus the Elijah? Right? They're trying to figure that out. But Jesus is saying, no, I'm not that Elijah. He's saying Elijah has come first. And he talks about it in other places in the Gospels. That actually that Elijah is John the Baptist. John the Baptist is that Elijah that was going to pave the way for the Messiah. And like the original Elijah, they treated him very badly. In fact, the original Elijah was abused and had a lot of persecution from, remember Ahab and Jezebel and all that, the whole story around him? Well, we don't have Ahab and Jezebel here, but we have Herod and his daughter-in-law. Suddenly I forget her name. But anyways, the one who danced for him. And she got John the Baptist to be killed, to be beheaded for her. So here we have Jesus saying, they're going to do to this Elijah. They've done to him, just like, but not exactly the same, but basically Ahab and Jezebel just basically did what they wanted with that Elijah. And now this Elijah is going to be treated badly. So he's talking about John the Baptist. Right? The crux here is that the change, the company, the clouds, the commands, what they all mean is that Jesus is the Messiah and he's the Son of God. The answer to the question, who do the people say that I am? Remember, Jesus said, then they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets. The answer is that Jesus is the one that you need to listen to in your life. No question about it, no confusion. Hebrews 1:1 says, in the past, God spoke to our forefathers, to the prophets at many times and in many ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory, and the exact representation of his being. Wow. Sustaining all things by his powerful word. Today, we see, if you open your eyes, you will see who Jesus is, and the brilliance of who he is. We have seen his glory, says John, the glory of the one and the only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. From the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. But he's not the Messiah that they expected. His glory comes in relationship to his suffering, his death, and his resurrection, and his ascension. The God-man is going to suffer. And that is a proclamation that every Muslim in this world finds abhorrent. But he's going to be exalted as well. We struggle with those, right? Don't we? Many people struggle. Some people cannot accept a suffering Messiah. But I suspect that a lot of us in our society suffer with the opposite. It's not that we don't think Christ can suffer. We make God too small in our lives. We've forgotten the wonder of who he really is. The primacy, the claims. I am the way, he said, the truth and life. No one comes to the Father except by me. There's no other way to God but through Jesus. Jesus stands out because of his claims. He claimed to be the light of the world. He claimed to be the good shepherd of all people. He claimed to be the bread of life. He said that he had been sent by his Father, God, and that the words he spoke were the words of God. I am the way, the truth, and life, he said. He called himself the resurrection and the life. He claimed that if any believed in him, eternal life would be theirs. He claimed to offer salvation to all of humanity. He claimed to be able to make all of creation right with God and bring us into a relationship with God. He claimed royalty as the returning king. He claimed divinity as God on earth. If we didn't have Jesus, what happens to our beliefs? What happens to everything that we are here for as a church? Without Jesus, there's no more purpose for the Bible. No more forgiveness. No more hope for salvation. No more restoration of our relationship with God. No more heaven. Possibility of us being with him in heaven. Hell is our destiny. And as we heard yesterday, it's not a time of a purgatory for restoration of people doing enough prayers for us on earth. That's it for eternity. Without Jesus, you no longer have a genuine faith. We have nothing. Jesus looks at his disciples and he looks at you and I today and says, who am I to you? Consider the weight of that question. Is he just another religious figure? Is he just symbolizing a set of rules? Is he just a good teacher? Do you see him as greater than the prophets? Is he just one other prophet like Adam to the Muslims? If he's anything less than God, the Messiah, to you today, then that's not good enough. That's not good enough. Peter said, "You are the Christ, the living God." Dan Kimball writes in his book, "They like Jesus, but not the church." He writes about the thoughts of many people whom he surveyed. They find Jesus attractive, but they don't care for organized religion. Many people today, he says, especially among emerging generations, don't resonate with the church and organized Christianity. They are leaving the church, and others are never part of the church in the first place. Sometimes it's because of misperceptions about the church. Yet often they are spiritually open, and they're fascinated about Jesus, but they haven't really fully accepted who he is. Who is Jesus to you? Who is he? As I said before, I think from this pulpit, that was the first question that they asked me in my accreditation interview recently. And I shared that with tears, as I often do. Not always, but I often do. I shared that he's my best friend in this universe. My wife is here. She's the second. But he is God. It's a crucial question. The question that we all need to answer. And if you haven't acknowledged him as Lord, you need to confront this question head on. But when you answer that question, depending on how you answer that question, it determines, there is a call to response as a result. We have to respond. Because we have to ask ourselves, what kind of God do you believe in? Is he some divine party pooper that ruins your life of fun? Is he an intelligent but uninvolved, non-caring God? Is he vindictive? Is he a petty God? Is he too important to you to take care of your little things in life that are problems? Well, today, every gospel, and I echo that, declare to you that he is a glorious, powerful God that loves you, despite the huge defects in your life, the sins that you've committed, that addiction that you're struggling with, those failures that you've made in this life, either with yourself or with your family, a spouse, a parent, a sibling, a child, a grandchild. Despite all of the big mistakes that you've made, he loves you. And he is a big God, big enough to take care of all of your problems. And he is concerned with your problems. You're not alone. You're not alone. For those of you that believe in that big God, does your life reflect it? And do you show by the risks that you take, by the sacrifices that you make, by the comments, your testimony to your fellow workers or your family, do you show that you believe in that kind of God? Or is your God so petty that he's unable to protect you? There's an amazing story by Max Lucado. It's not a story, it's a real life biography. He wrote a book called The Applause of Heaven. And Max, great writer, he says this: if there ever was a person who could have offered Jesus an excuse, Robert Reed would have been that person. His hands are twisted and his feet are useless. He cannot bathe himself, he cannot feed himself, he cannot brush his teeth, comb his hair, or put on his own underwear. His shirts are held together by strips of Velcro. His speech drags on like a worn-out audio cassette because Robert has cerebral palsy, right? The disease keeps him from driving a car, from riding a bike, and going for a walk. But it didn't keep him from graduating from high school or attending Abilene Christian University, and then later on other seminaries, from which he graduated with a degree in Latin. And having cerebral palsy didn't keep him from teaching at St. Louis Junior College or from venturing overseas on 5 mission trips. And Robert's disease didn't keep him from becoming a missionary to Portugal. He moved to Lisbon alone By the way, now he's married, as you see from his website and from that picture. He moved to Portugal alone in 1972. And there he rented a hotel room and began studying Portuguese. He found a restaurant owner who would feed him after the rush hour and a tutor who would instruct him in the language. And he stationed himself daily in a park, and he distributed brochures about Jesus. And within 6 years, he led 70 people to the Lord. How many people have you led to the Lord in your lifetime? Robert Reed didn't see fit to offer excuses to the Lord. Now, that was written by Max Lucado years ago. You can follow up on his website now and see how much more he's done. He still teaches and preaches, and he teaches at lectures for Christ. He still leads people to the Lord, with his wife now helping him as well. Because Jesus is who he is, we can have hope. Right? Now, Robert Reed, for him to start turning around, for some of you, it's years of being crippled by fear, by disaster, by addiction, by pain. And yes, those are all very real, and God doesn't discount those things, okay? But it's the wounded healer, the wounded witness, that is often the most effective witness in this world. Because people see who we are, and we point to Jesus and say, it's not us that's going to save you, it's him. And look what he's done in my life. It's the person who has been the most pushed down and most burdened and most failed person in this world that turns around and says, I refuse to be discouraged because I know whom I believed and I'm persuaded that he's able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. That's the person whom the Lord uses. I know this is kind of long, but I want to end off with this poem by Lita Kurtzer. She says, I refuse to be discouraged. I refuse to be discouraged, to be sad or to cry. I refuse to be downhearted, and here's the reason why. I have a God who's mighty, who's sovereign and supreme. I have a God who loves me, and I am on his team. He is all-wise and powerful. Jesus is his name. Though everything is changeable, my God remains the same. My God knows all that's happening, beginning to the end. His presence is my comfort. He is my dearest friend. When sickness comes to weaken me, to bring my head down low, I call upon my mighty God. Into his arms I go. When circumstances threaten to rob me from my peace, he draws me close upon his breast, where all my strivings cease. And when my heart melts within me, and weaknesses take control, he gathers me into his arms and soothes my heart and soul. The great I am is with me. My life is in his hand. The Son of the Lord is my hope. It's in his strength I stand. I refuse to be defeated. My eyes are on my God. He has promised to be with me as through this life I trod. I'm looking past all my circumstances to heaven's throne above. My prayers have reached the heart of God. I'm resting in his love. I give God thanks in everything. My eyes are on his face. The battle's his. The victory is mine. He helps me with the race.